USC and UCLA will be out of the Pac-12 by 2024, and they will take the LA TV market with them. Can the Pac-12 survive? Let's go.
Locked On Pac-12, your daily podcast on the Pac-12 Conference. It's the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Locked On Pac-12. I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin, D1 play-by-play broadcaster. Thanks for making this your first listen or your first view of the day. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your number one source to stay up to date with the Conference of Champions, which may or may not exist in a couple of years. We're going to talk about that today. Like, comment, subscribe wherever you're listening to or watching the show. Thank you to everybody out there who helped us get to 500 subscriptions on YouTube. Let's get to 1,000, because why not? Before the conference goes away, let's just do something cool before that happens. Today's episode brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. Those of you watching on YouTube see that I've got a brand new guest here on the show, my good friend and former Sports Talk radio host and Stanford graduate, Dev Bhargava. I haven't had a Stanford guy come on yet, and I thought, you know what? Dave knows Stanford as well as anybody. He's also as opinionated as anybody that I know. Dave, welcome to Locked On Pac-12.
Thank you so much, Spencer. It is a pleasure to be on.
So let's start with the biggest question right now that is on the mind of really every Pac-12 sports fan, except for USC and UCLA, and they probably don't care quite as much at this point in time. You lose the Bruins, you lose the Trojans, you lose the TV market, you lose a couple big brands. UCLA bigger in basketball, USC bigger in football. Can the Pac-12 survive? Like, is there a path forward where the conference exists in 5 years?
5 years? There's not a path forward for this conference to exist by 2024. I don't know if you saw this, but in the wake of USC and UCLA leaving the conference, obviously your favorite university, the University of Oregon, was approached, and all the media people wanted to know, are y'all next? Are you going to follow in the footsteps of USC and UCLA? And the answer, I thought, was very telling. The answer that was given by the official University of Oregon spokesperson was no comment. Now, let me tell you one thing. If my girlfriend asked me, hey, did you go on a date with that woman over there? And I said, at this time, I have no further comment. You know how much trouble I would be in?
A lot.
That's not what you say. It is very clear that Oregon is exploring their options. We saw earlier today that Washington's been exploring their options. Obviously, no deal is done yet. But when you look at this conference, this thing is already on life support. First things first, you're no longer the Pac-12, so you might need to rename this show. But if Oregon and Washington leave, what do you have left? Even if Oregon stays, you're telling me that Utah, which, don't get me wrong, Whittingham is an outstanding coach. They've been outperforming their sort of their baseline expectations for years and years under him. It's a fantastic program, obviously always in contention for Pac-12 South, always in contention for Rose Bowl berths, etc. You're telling me that these TV markets can keep things afloat? You're going to rely on Oregon State Beavers fans, the state of Utah, Northern California, and not, sexy Northern California. We're talking about Stanford University fans, Stanford University students who famously can't come to the games without bringing their laptops to work on problem sets. I mean, where are the eyeballs going to come from? I have no faith in this conference to survive even until 2024. And I just can't believe that this is happening so fast. Like, we got no signals this was going to happen. And we went from, okay, Pac-12, Power 5 conference, talking about things like, should we do auto-qualifying berths? How do we bring the Pac-12 back to relevance? All the way to Pac-12 is not going to exist. ACC's freaking out. 2 mega conferences forming. I mean, A, this is so unbelievably exciting, but B, if I'm a Pac-12 fan, which I am absolutely terrified of what the future holds.
Yeah, and the interesting part about it is whether or not Oregon and Washington actually go, because there's been a lot of speculation, and I believe the official wording from the University of Oregon representatives were nothing to report at this time. That would be even worse than if you told your girlfriend no comment. Like, I have nothing to report at this time. Like, So that to me very clearly indicates that Oregon is looking at moving to a different conference, and you have to have somebody go with you. You can't go by yourself. It's why Texas and Oklahoma went together, why USC and UCLA went together, because you have to keep the even number of teams in a conference, or else it gets really tricky, and you have to pull someone else from a different part of the country. That would get weird. You need a travel partner as well. I think as it pertains to the Big Ten, Oregon's most likely partner there is Washington. And interestingly enough, we're recording this on Friday, and this is Monday's show. I was talking with Max Torres of Sports Illustrated, and we were talking over on Locked On Ducks about whether or not they could potentially go, and nothing at that time when we recorded had changed. But then I saw someone who covers college football nationally say that the Big Ten has told Oregon and Washington at this time that they're going to stand pat and not add more teams right now. But I mean, again, that verbiage in there at this time, and I'm not reporting that. I'm telling you what other people say. I'm not a Big J journalist. That's not my chosen profession, and probably a good thing too. But anyway, if they're told at this time we're not going to put you into the Big Ten, that doesn't mean that it can't happen. Like that was how I interpreted of, okay, Oregon is clearly looking at this, and Washington logically is going to be the team that goes with them, because Oregon State and Washington State, who have done some nice things, I think made some nice coaching hires, moving in a positive direction. I've talked about all that this offseason here on the show. It's not enough. They are not big enough programs for the Big Ten to say, yeah, okay, we would admit you. So Washington's the logical travel partner there for Oregon as the team you would add. And it would even make more sense to add 4 teams than to just add 2, because when you think about the extensive amount of travel that you're going to have to do if you're these LA schools, it would make some sense to have those games, which would probably be protected rivalries within the Big Ten if it ever did come to fruition with all 4 teams. And you could have them, doing a more reasonable travel schedule where you'd have 2 more road games or 2 opponents where you'd just be going, up and down the West Coast as you were before. But if Oregon and Washington leave, I'm with you. There's just nothing left in the Pac-12. But do you think that is a given that they're going to leave? Because the Big Ten has apparently said right now, we're not going to admit you at this time, but that doesn't mean it couldn't happen later. But does that create a sliver of an opening for George Kliavkoff to either talk to other Power 5 schools or go to Oregon and Washington and say, look, we still believe this is the best place for you here? Is there, a possibility that could be the case?
So ultimately, I think that the Big Ten is sure they're saying they want to stand pat, and of course they will, because they got everything they wanted, right? They got the biggest brands from the Pac-12. Of course we can have the discussion whether Oregon or UCLA, but obviously USC, thanks to Pete Carroll, largely is what everyone thinks about when they think about the Pac-12.
Yep.
If they don't live on the West Coast, and Big Ten now has a nice foothold in the California recruiting market, right? California famously is the state that keeps college football alive on the West Coast, right? And now all these Big Ten schools, right, or Ohio State, Michigan, they're licking their lips because they're saying, now I'm not only getting some recruits from the South, obviously the bulk of my talent from the Midwest, I also have the California recruiting market. We get USC's brand, we get all that money. Ultimately, I think what is going to decide whether or not Oregon and Washington move is the dollar bill aspect of it, right? The reason that we're seeing all these moves happen this year, in my opinion, is large, because of course these conversations have been going on for years and years. It's 100% money, and it's money related to the NIL, right? Oregon is now in an incredibly tough spot, right? Because now, think about it this way. You realize that all these players are going to want to get paid. They're going to want to get the TV exposure. All these kids that maybe were going to come to Oregon are committed to USC. Now they're getting primetime games, right, on television. They're seeing, once you're in the Big Ten Conference, you need to be paying your players the same way that, a kid that goes to Ohio State, making big 7 figures, you're going to have to pay your players that same amount of money, right? And obviously there's still a lot of legislation that needs to shake out with regards to the NIL, but ultimately Oregon needs to move. Washington needs to move. So if the Big Ten says, no, we're standing pat, why don't you look at something like the ACC if you're Oregon or Washington? What's the point of staying in the Pac-12 when the TV money is going to dry up? You're going to lose a ton of recruiting prowess in California. You need to make a drastic move if you're Oregon. I think what you're saying about the Big Ten taking on a couple more Pac-12 teams so the travel schedule isn't as brutal, so the culture fit maybe lines up a little bit more, makes a whole lot of sense. But if the Big Ten truly is going to stand pat, and they're not just using that as a negotiating tactic as a way to kind of get leverage in whatever kind of deal they're trying to form. Why don't you as Oregon go look at the ACC? You know that Notre Dame's been looking at ACC. You mentioned that you need 2 teams to join a conference. How about if you're Oregon, you say, you know what, Washington, I don't need you, right? I'm going with Notre Dame. We're joining the ACC, and now you've got a number of big programs. Obviously, you can't stand up to the SEC now with Texas and Oklahoma. You can't really stand up to the Big Ten now with USC, UCLA, in addition to their powers currently. But you do have a case where you can say, hey, it's not 2 super conferences. It's going to be 3 because we're getting Notre Dame, we're getting Oregon. The ACC also has a foothold in this whole discussion.
I hadn't thought about the ACC a bunch, and there's a reason for that. But if you think this is going to impact teams' wins and loss records, then maybe you'd want to go to BetOnline to place your wagers. I know that my good friend Dave here is a betting man, and BetOnline is your number one source for all your betting needs and sports info. You can find all the latest sports developments, league reviews, and news, including Major League Baseball this year. Go Mariners! BetOnline is your continued source for all your sports wagering information, including live betting, esports, and scores. And it remains the best spot for all your sports scores, podcasts, and news this season. BetOnline is the fastest and easiest way to check in on all your favorite sports and events, including MMA, boxing, and my personal favorite, golf. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends in action. BetOnline is where the game starts. I think the ACC would be a stretch, because I think the travel schedule and the geography is a fascinating component of LA schools going to the Big Ten. I mean, it's so weird. In 2024, Los Angeles is going to be Big Ten country. That is a weird thing to say, but it's very true. I think that's a little bit of a stretch, but doable. But the ACC, Oregon is so isolated, and if you had Notre Dame as the other team there, I think that is a hop, skip, and a jump too far for them to go from a scheduling perspective. I mean, that's just an outrageous amount of travel, and you'd almost want to take your team and have them go beyond the road for a month and just stay in hotels over at that point. I mean, it would just be so much flying all the way across the country. I don't think that would work. I've heard the SEC and Big 12 get thrown around as, maybe that's a place that Oregon could want to go. I don't think it necessarily has to be the Big Ten. The SEC would be fascinating, though. I don't know if the SEC would take Washington necessarily, but I feel like the Big Ten or the Big 12 would take them. But here's another thought, because I've had this with regards to the Pac-12's viability going forward. If you're George Kliavkoff right now, you're calling Larry Scott and leaving him an angry voicemail. And then what you're doing is trying to figure out how you could possibly keep this conference together so that you'll have a job in a couple years. And there are a couple different routes that you could go. First way is look at Mountain West schools. And yeah, it's not going to be the same, but if you're able to keep Oregon and Washington, you could say Oregon, Washington, Utah, and then hope one of those schools, maybe a Boise or a San Diego State, San Diego State, now that you don't have LA schools, might make a lot of sense looking at the SoCal area, and they've been a really good program. I'll talk about that more on tomorrow's episode. But if you're able to do that, then you hope they can make a Utah type of leap to where they become a relevant team nationally, and they're working their way into the top 25 consistently. I think that could be an option. But another thing you could think about if you're Kliavkoff is, do you call the Big 12, which doesn't feel as dire of a situation as the Pac-12 right now, but still it's not in a great spot losing your 2 flagship schools. It just doesn't feel quite as monumentous on a national level because the Big Ten is going national with their conference in going to get USC and UCLA from the state of California and the city of Los Angeles. So if you're Kliavkoff, do you pick up the phone and call the Big 12, maybe leave a second angry voicemail for Larry Scott, and then call the Big 12 and say, should we join forces here? Should we try and, work our way into being one of these 3 mega conferences where it's the Big 10, SEC, and the Big 12, and then, maybe force Clemson's hand to join up somewhere else? Do you think that's something he could do?
I think it's not out of the question. I think the biggest thing for the Pac-12, even let alone the fact that you're losing your biggest brand in USC, is the time zone problem. So I want to just put some numbers to it so we're on the same page, if viewers are on the same page. The TV contract for the Pac-12 sounds very large, right? It's $1 billion over 12 years. Or excuse me, $3 billion over 12 years. That's what they're currently locked into. Okay, that's a lot of money. It seems totally reasonable. The Big Ten is currently negotiating a deal that would pay them $1 billion per year. $1 billion per year.
Yeah.
Okay, and this is still in the negotiation process, which means the number is going to end up higher than that. Part of the reason is you got those big brands, you got the best rivalry in college football, or Ohio State and Michigan. Of course, fine. But part of the reason is nobody watches Pac-12 games. Look, I live on the East Coast now, and in order to watch regular season Pac-12 football, you think I'm going to stay up to midnight to watch the end of an absolutely riveting Washington State-Utah game in October? Absolutely not. But if I'm sitting on my couch and it's 6 p.m. and, I get to watch the Cornhuskers just passively while I'm making dinner, of course I'm going to tune in, watch a little bit of action and watch a bunch of players that I've never seen before. So I think you can save this conference, but I think 100% the direction you have to go is roping in the Big 12, roping in some schools that are in the middle of the country. That helps you regain, this sort of time zone advantage that the other conferences have. It helps you regain a little bit of a foothold in recruiting ground in different states. But to me, I think the fundamental problem with all of this, and something that's not really being discussed, is can you imagine, even now, can you imagine a bunch of California kids who go to school in Los Angeles where the weather never drops below 70 degrees, there's never any wind, it barely rains? These kids are going to go play football in middle America in December. Columbus, Ohio in December. You mentioned the travel. That is a 5-hour flight from Los Angeles. You get up at the crack of dawn, you fly to Columbus. When you left Los Angeles, it was 75, a little bit of cloudy. You get to Columbus, it's negative 15 degrees Fahrenheit. You think USC is going to compete first year? I understand they got Lincoln Riley. I understand that they got Caleb Williams. This is going to be an incredibly hard transition. And I think this is something you need to think about. If you're the Pac-12 commissioner, you're Larry Scott, you're thinking, how do I save my conference? Well, put your conference in position for success. I don't know if these kids are going to have success in the first couple years before you're recruiting well from the middle of the country, flying out 5 hours every week to go play in a terrain that is incredibly different than where they go to school. I think that weather is a really, really important factor that we have to consider.
Yeah, and if you're looking at it from the point of view of the LA schools, it's not like every game is going to be that. You're probably looking at 1, maybe 2 games a year where you're going to have to deal with conditions you wouldn't normally see on the West Coast, unless you're maybe up in Pullman playing Washington State or Seattle. Can't, but I mean you can get some frigid temperatures, you can get some snow, but I think that only comes into play a little bit later in the season. I agree with you though on the time zone thing. Like Pac-12 after dark, yeah, there's a bunch of craziness. It's wild. It like for whatever reason it gets nuts. There have been some insane games on Friday and Saturday nights over the years for Pac-12 after dark, and it's got a logo that goes around on social media. All that stuff is good and fine and fun. But the nuts and bolts of it speak to the poorly negotiated media rights deal by Larry Scott that new commissioner George Kliavkoff now has to reckon with, because to your point, people are not watching those games on the East Coast. So you're not getting as much exposure, and you're not getting as higher ratings, which means you don't have as much money to bring in to then distribute back to your schools. And going back to the financial discussion that you alluded to a little bit earlier as well, when you look at the payouts that conferences are making to teams on a yearly basis, we're talking tens of millions of dollars more. Like on an annual basis in 2022, this according to SI, I read this earlier today, the 2022 payouts from the conferences to schools were $57 million in the Big Ten, 54 in the SEC, about 41 in the Big 12, 34 in the Pac-12, and about 31 in the ACC. I mean, that's massive. That's not like, oh, they have so much money. Like, what's a few $10 million? You go to any athletic director, I dare you to find me one at any school. It could be Texas, it could be Duke, it could be USC. I don't care. I dare you to find one who wouldn't say, yeah, that would make a difference in how we operate as an athletics department. And the TV, and then the other part of it is, you're losing Los Angeles now as the Pac-12. That's not your market anymore. And that was a huge, huge draw, and you don't have that. is it enough to survive as a conference with Oregon and Washington and Utah and a couple Mountain West schools? Yes. Are you Power 5? Barely. I mean, you become even more comparable to the American Conference, I would say. And your biggest media market there is probably Seattle. I would guess. I'm not a Nielsen ratings guru or anything of the sorts, but I mean, it just becomes tougher to compete when you look at the nut. You got to get, if you're a commissioner, you need people to know who your conference or who the teams in your conference are, and you need them to watch the games, both to grow that familiarity, but also because that's how money comes in. That's a big part of why the Pac-12 is behind the other conferences financially. I mean, the Big 12 has had really just a couple good teams over the years. They've seen some growth, certainly. Baylor has had a couple really nice years. They've got a great coach in Dave Aranda. Oklahoma State has been a real steady presence there. Like, they've had some teams that have been respectable and solid, so they're a little bit deeper in the Pac-12, but are they that much better? Like Big 10 or SEC better? I'd say no, but the financials are there because they've got some more markets that they can exploit. Oklahoma is really big. Texas, of course, has got a bunch of eyeballs as well. And so you just run into a numbers issue when you take out the millions of people and college football fans in Los Angeles from your conference. That's why it looks like for schools like Oregon and Washington, it might be the best path forward financially to jump ship, because you're looking around going, how are you going? Like, financially, we were already behind as a conference. How are you going to close the gap when you lose Los Angeles? Like, that's a really tough sell for Kliavkoff, isn't it?
Yeah, and 100%. And on your point, which I think is right on the nose, we've already agreed that you're not going to get the eyeballs during the, for Pac-12 after dark from the East Coast, from the big media markets, throughout the Midwest. Like, they're not going to, you never have. And so your goal as Pac-12 commissioner, right, is to have your teams perform well in the postseason. You need a team in the New Year's Six, and thank goodness for the Rose Bowl for you for the last X amount of years, because everybody knows the Rose Bowl. Everybody watches the Rose Bowl. That's the time where, people on a national stage start to understand the Oregon brand. They see the cool Nike jerseys. They understand the high-flying Chip Kelly offenses. Like, that's when you make your money as a Pac-12 school. You become a national brand at these big bowl games, whether that's competing in the CFP, whether that's competing not just in the New Year's Six, but towards New Year's Day in a legitimate bowl. And now I think you find yourself in a really tough position. What happens to the Rose Bowl, right? If Oregon and Washington jump ship, what is the incentive for the Rose Bowl to have auto-qualifying berths from the Pac-12, where your best case scenario?
Because the Rose Bowl is, sorry to cut you off,
it's
but
at UCLA. It's at UCLA.
Yeah, the Rose Bowl is where UCLA plays, but also when you talk about the Rose Bowl committee, they are their own entity. It is
right.
Like the Rose Bowl has historically had that contract between, originally the Pac-8, now the Pac-12, and the Big 10. But if the Pac-12 ceases to have anybody who's consistently good or nationally relevant, or they don't think the conference is good enough, I don't know what the contracts are, but the Rose Bowl committee are their own people whose job it is to make that game as big as possible. If you lose the Rose Bowl, you're done.
100%. And let's not pretend like USC and UCLA have been holding this conference up. Frankly, they've been embarrassments the last, sort of for the vast majority of the last decade or so. Fine. However, the brand power can't be discounted. And the brand power, the staying power, the visual of having USC, the Trojans in the Rose Bowl, or UCLA playing in their own stadium in the Rose Bowl, these are things that keep the Rose Bowl committee interested, right? Why would you stay? You don't. You're not going to keep the Pac-12, as we've talked about, which will look more like the Mountain West or the American Conference, like a mid-major conference rather than as something that's in the vein of the Power Five. You're not going to keep that as part of the New Year's Six. So if that is the case, right, I don't know how you save this conference, right? The Rose Bowl's out the window. Your biggest brands are out the window. I don't know where you go. And the other thing that's important to think about is, fine, if the Rose Bowl goes out the window, you can still qualify for the CFP. You could still play in the Rose Bowl just as a college football semifinal. The thing is, there's so much uncertainty with how the playoff committee's outlook is going to be going forward as soon as 2024 hits, right? Because it used to be, okay, if you're undefeated and you're in a Power 5 conference, you're almost certainly into the playoff. There's basically zero chance you won't be in the playoff. If you're a one-loss champion from the SEC, kind of the conferences we view as more legitimate, the SEC or the Big Ten, 99.9% chance you're in. And if you have one loss and you're not a conference champion in any of those conferences, you might make it in, like we've seen with Ohio State, like we've seen with Alabama over the years that we've had the CFP. Now your job gets really complicated because it used to be, right? If you go back and look at the last 5-7 years, as long as we've had the CFP, if you go back and look, the conferences have largely been incredibly top heavy. People like to suggest like there's a lot of parity in college football from time to time. That's not true. We know that Clemson, Ohio State, Alabama, these are the names that we're going to be saying, at the end of the year, every year. The reason that they're able to be successful is Alabama schedules Cupcake State, 2 games a year. And then the bottom half of the SEC and the bottom half of the Big Ten are the dregs of college football. They're terrible programs. You can't blame them because all the kids from those regions want to go to the power schools. They want to go to Alabama. They want to go to Georgia. So you get a school like Kentucky, right? Basketball school that happens to have a football team in your conference, and you beat up on them. You get Vanderbilt, a team that should belong in the newly forming Pac-12, right? Or maybe they should be relegated to the Mountain West themselves. I don't know. But point is, the kind of default positions that we know the college football playoff committee used to have, which is one-loss Pac-12 champion, maybe in, likely out, one-loss SEC champion, definitely in, undefeated Pac-12 champion, definitely in. These kind of things are going to change drastically when you've got Texas and Oklahoma in the SEC, and when you've got UCLA and USC in the Big Ten, because now, right, these conferences are going to cannibalize each other. Now you've got to play a number of conference games. So if you're Ohio State, it's not just, okay, we play cupcakes except for Michigan and Michigan State, this type of thing. Right now you've got 4 real games with top 25 teams on your schedule. And so now we could easily have a number 1 seed at the end of the year that has 2 or 3, even 3, I could see losses depending on how that, the different conferences line up and how the schedules line up, right? And so understanding what it takes to make the CFP as part of a Pac-12 conference that doesn't have USC, that doesn't have UCLA, is incredibly complicated. Does undefeated Oregon make it over 2-loss Big Ten champion USC? I don't know. How about a 1-loss non-conference champion Big Ten team that's a big brand, right? USC, Ohio State, Michigan. They've got to make it over lossless Oregon. If lossless Oregon's only beaten Oregon State, Utah, and so on and so forth in games that no one's watched, I think this problem that the Pac-12 currently has of trying to get conference legitimacy is just going to be extremely exacerbated as we enter completely uncharted territory for this playoff committee. And I think that's another thing you have to consider if you're trying to save the Pac-12 in its current incarnation.
Here's the hypothetical we will close with today, talking to Dev Bhargava, former sports talk radio host and a frequent guest on shows I've hosted in the past as well. And he is a Stanford grad. And I want to ask you briefly about Stanford in this hypothetical. This is something I could very realistically see playing out just as, again, a hypothetical that I'm concocting on my own accord. Oregon and Washington go to the Big Ten. Rumors have been there. At that point, if the conference ceases to exist, you have to then ask the question where everybody else goes and what show I will then be hosting at that point in time. But let's cross that bridge when we come to it. I think at that point, Arizona and Arizona State would look at the Big 12, and then you'd be left with 4 schools that don't have, I think, an obvious choice as to where to go. Oregon State, Washington State, Stanford, Cal. To me, Stanford feels like they could go independent and be like Notre Dame. That is a very realistic option in my view when you consider both schools have stringent academic standards and have that sort of rich tradition, and of course their rivals that play every year. So let's say that happened. Cal, Washington State, Oregon State. Are there options just Mountain West or nothing? Because I don't see either the Big 12 or I could see the Big 12 adding the Arizona schools because you've got a geographical similarity a little bit there. It's not that far from Texas and some of those Big 12 schools. You also have a decent number of recruits in Arizona that the Big 12 might want to tap in. Like, there are advantages there. There's a reason I think that works. But Oregon State, Washington State, Cal, would they actually have to go to the Mountain West? I like what if that were to happen? Those 3 schools, and you can opine about Stanford as well. Like, what do they do?
I think they have to go to the Mountain West. I don't think you have a choice. And this is the problem when you're not a powerful brand in your conference. You are beholden to the whims of what the actual powerful brands in your conference are going to do. Right? There is no conference left. The conference is currently on life support, as we've talked about ad nauseum. But there is no conference left if Oregon and Washington leave. You have to go somewhere. The Mountain West is standing there with open arms. They have a little bit of TV money, right? They'll be able to support your small programs. Stanford is in a really tough spot. I think you drew a lot of important parallels with Notre Dame, like the academic quality, the fact that David Shaw is one of the highest paid coaches in the league. Clearly, there's a lot of booster money, a lot of interest from the top. The problem with Stanford is that Notre Dame draws eyeballs to the television screen. There's a reason that the College Football Playoff Committee loves putting Notre Dame into the playoff and watching them get waxed in the first round.
People
watch. Not because they have it's not because they have a chance to win. The question is, who do we want getting waxed by 35 points against Alabama? And against, when the choice is between Notre Dame and any Pac-12 school, they always choose Notre Dame. It's because the fan base is rabid. There's this expression that they use a lot, right, in the SEC, right? It means more. Well, it means more, not just in the SEC. It means more. This is part of the reason that I think the Texas-Oklahoma thing is going to work seamlessly with the SEC is I've been lucky enough to be in the state of Texas during the Red River rivalry, right? When Texas plays Oklahoma. And the whole state, everywhere you go, you either have to be wearing that dark red maroon color or you have to be wearing the burnt orange and white. There's no option.
Crimson's the color.
Crimson. Thank you. There's no option, right? All the bars are full. All the TVs are on. If you are not indoors watching the game or outdoors watching the game, right, you are a pariah in Texas at the time. That's going to work great with the SEC. With Stanford, they should change their school slogan to "It means less." Because, my God, it doesn't matter how good this team is. Nobody watches. Right? Notre Dame, it means more. People tune in. The playoff committee wants them in. That's how you work as an independent, right? They've been left out a couple times, and that's why these conversations with the ACC have sort of been going on for the last, 10 years, let's say. But Stanford doesn't have that backing. If Stanford were to go independent, they'd be playing in the Buffalo Wild Wings Bowl every year until I no longer am on this planet. Like, there's no hope for them. No one wants Stanford. Stanford fans don't even want Stanford. So I'm sorry. I got to relegate the dregs of the conference to the Mountain West. And if I'm Stanford, I'm begging to get invited because as an independent, you're going to have to close up your sports programs. I mean, Stanford's got a sporting athletic excellence across a wide variety of sports. And we've talked almost exclusively about football in this conversation. But it's important to understand that, when USC and UCLA are moving to the Big Ten, they're taking all their teams with them. Right? That includes basketball. For UCLA, that includes gymnastics. Like, there's a lot of excellence up and down the list of sports. Stanford has that same excellence, but without a proper home for your football team, which is supposed to be your cash cow, you can say goodbye to the rest of it.
It is the Conference of Champions in just about every college sport, except for the two drivers of the bus, football and men's basketball. Like, that's the irony of all of this is, yeah, I think you make a valid point there that you'd be in a tough situation. The other side of it is Stanford could always just bankroll with the money they have at the school in general, because as you well know, having graduated from that university in Palo Alto, they are not short on funds for literally anything that they decide that they want to put money into. They've got the funds, they've got the donors and the boosters to do it. I don't know the difference between a donor and a booster. I guess a booster is probably just like regular, like more like recurring. Like, is there a semantic difference there, or is that just saying the same word twice?
I'm not 100% sure either, but let's call them the same.
Yeah, we'll call it good, and we'll call it there. Call it good there for today. Dev Bhargava, former radio show host at Stanford and frequent guest on my shows. I've talked to him many a times, and this is the first time he has been on the show. If you don't like him, hop in the YouTube comments and let me know that I shouldn't bring him back. But thanks for coming on, Dave. Good talking.
Spencer, let me sign off with this. College football needs a commissioner, and I can be unemployed and ready to work in a heartbeat. Thanks so much for having me on.
see you next time. Thanks, everybody, for listening. I'll see you next time, and have a wonderful rest of your day.